to the Waffle Flower channel. This is Debbie from limedoodledesign.com and I'm with you today to look at this Moonlight Pumpkin watercoloured card using the Trick or Treat set. I've cut a piece of Archer's cold pressed watercolour card and popped that into the Mini Misty stamping tool, and then I'm lining up the pumpkins from the Trick or Treat set along the bottom. I'm stamping the pumpkins with VersaFine Onyx Black, and I'm going to stamp them several times to make sure that I get a really good impression, a really nice solid black outline to the pumpkins. I'm taping the card down to a board, and this will help prevent the watercolour card from warping when I start adding the water. I want the sky above my pumpkins to have a nice big moon, and I'm going to use the Molotov masking fluid pen to help me with that. I've drawn a pencil circle onto the card, and then I'm going to trace over that with the masking fluid, and that will protect the edge of the moon when I start to come and paint the sky. I'm going to let the masking fluid dry while I start to paint the pumpkins. I want the pumpkins to have quite a rough and ready watercolour look. I don't want it to be too detailed, and I'm going to start by adding some water to the areas I want to watercolour first, and then start to drop in some colour. Adding a layer of water and then dropping in the colour is known as the wet on wet technique, and I like to use this as my first layer of a watercolour. I love the way that the colours sort of seep slowly through the water and give a really nice base to your first layer of watercolouring. Once I've got that first layer of watercolour down, I can then start to bring in some darker colours into the shadows and start to bring this pumpkin to life and make it look more three-dimensional. For those of you that have not seen my watercolour palette before, I've got a combination of different companies within the palette. These are my favourite watercolours, and they come from companies such as Sminker, Daily Rowney, Winsor & Newton and Daniel Smith. Having dried off this layer, I'm going to add a few more touches of darker colour here and there before I move on to watercolouring the sky. Again, for the sky, I'm going to start with the wet on wet technique, and I've added a layer of water over all the area for the sky, and then I'm going to start to bring in some colour. The masking fluid that I laid down earlier is now dry, and you need to make sure that you do that with masking fluid. You need to make sure it's really dry before you start painting anywhere near it, otherwise you won't be able to remove it properly when it comes to lifting it. I'm using a combination of blue and purple to give a spooky look to the sky and letting those colours blend in together. And then I'm also going to start adding some colour to the ground in front of the pumpkins, some greens and browns. I did add some yellow to the sky, but I didn't want to allow the colours to combine too much together because I thought the blue and the yellow would start to make green, and so I dried it off to stop that happening. When watercolours dry, they dry back lighter in colour than when they were wet, and so for this second layer I'm adding some darker tones to really get some atmosphere into the sky. I've added some silver paint splatter both while the watercolour was wet and then again once it was dry to give a more defined splatter look. And now I'm adding in some shadows into the ground in front of the pumpkins. I thought with the light shining from the moon there would be some deep shadows in front of the pumpkins. I've given that a final dry to make sure that the watercolour next to the masking fluid is perfectly dry, and if it is, then you can start to lift the masking fluid, and my preferred way to do that is with an eraser, with an adhesive eraser, and I find that comes up nice and cleanly then. I'm adding a pale yellow wash over the whole of the moon area, and then adding some deeper colours to one side, and then I thought I'd create some craters for the moon by adding in some, it's like a grey-brown colour, I think it's called sepia brown, and adding in a little of that to one side, and that will make it look like there's some craters on the moon. Once the watercolour was fully dry, I lifted the blue tape off and then I trimmed the panel down slightly. And then moving on to the sentiment panel, I wanted to keep with the watercolour look, and so I've got a scrap of some Archer's watercolour card and I'm watercolouring that in a nice deep rich purple. I'm going to give that a dry off and add a second layer, and then I can stamp the sentiment onto that. I've dried the piece off and I've popped it into the Mini Misty. I'm going to be white heat embossing the sentiment, and to prevent embossing powder sticking where I don't want it to, I've given the card a really good coating with some EK Success powder tool. I'm stamping the sentiment with Versamark ink, and again I'm going to make sure I do that several times to get a really good impression before sprinkling on the white embossing powder, and then making sure my heat tool is good and hot to melt the embossing powder. I've trimmed the sentiment piece down, added a ribbon end to one side, and then backed it with foam adhesive before placing it onto the watercoloured panel. I've then added more foam adhesive to the back of the watercolour piece and added that offset onto a card base. I'm adding some sequins of Range Multimedium in matte, and then that finishes this Moonlit Pumpkins watercoloured card. I'll leave you with some photographs and want to thank you for joining me today. For more product information, please visit waffleflower.com and follow on YouTube, Instagram and Facebook for more inspiration. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.